Last August, Professor Jay's report into child sexual exploitation in Rotherham described how vulnerable children have been repeatedly failed by a council paralysed by complacency, institutionalised political correctness and blatant failures of political and officer leadership.
So the local council in Rotherham, UK is set to resign en masse in the wake of an incriminating report on the Muslim rape gang scandal that came to light in August. British Communities secretaries had strong words for the inadequacy of the council in the House of Commons yesterday.
The voice of the victims has to be clearly heard. The crimes committed against children is so appalling. The council's remedy is so utterly inadequate. The government cannot, in good conscience, turn a blind eye.
George Igler is the director at the Discourse Institute. He joins me with more from London. George, great to see you again. We've talked about the case of Rotherham before, a city of just 250,000 where 1,400 different girls were raped. But this was not some random rape. All 1,400 girls were white girls, and all of the rapists in the rape gangs were Pakistani Muslim immigrants. And that, this investigation finds, is why the police and civil servants did nothing about it. They were afraid of being called racist if they stopped the rapes.
Indeed so. And of course, the one thing that you won't see mentioned in any of these reports is pretty much the word Muslim. Usually these revelations date to a report by Louise Casey, who delivered a report asked for by the House of Commons. Now, this is the upteenth report that refers to child sexual exploitation in Rotherham. I think for the benefit of your listeners, it's probably easy to unpack some of the dissembling and casuistry that governs this phenomenon. Child sexual exploitation is what basically the British establishment, the press and the politicians, the antiseptic term that they use to refer to our basically white slavery epidemic in this country. And Asian, which is the decided term with which the perpetrators of this crime are referred to, is essentially the term that we use for Muslims who commit acts that are deemed criminal but are essentially not considered immoral under Islamic law. And so Professor Alexis Jay issued this report that outlined the degree of complicity of the council's child protection services and police in horrendous abuse over 17 years that concerned 1,400 children. And this new report delves into the extent to which municipal government were involved, the heads of the councils, and also leads to the conclusion that the 1,400 number is a conservative estimate. And in the meantime, between the two reports, Parents Against Child Sexual Exploitation, which is the best charity, has said that this kind of behavior is far from limited to Rotherham. This is the rule rather than exception when it comes to white working class kids in Britain. Yeah, in fact, I just saw a new news story today in the British city of Halifax, not to be confused with the Canadian city of Halifax, of another, I think, 25 Muslim immigrants charged with rape gangs. And I'm sorry to give these ugly facts to our viewers, but you absolutely must know them. I mean, typically it is Muslim males between the age of 20 and 50, let's say. I mean, these are not teenagers. These are middle-aged gangs who recruit white girls as young as 12, even younger, I'm sure. They, offer them liquor, they offer them drugs, they get them in a compromising position. Maybe they take pictures of them engaged in early sex, and they blackmail them, and then they hook them on drugs, and they turn them into prostitutes for their own sexual satisfaction and that of the rape gang. Would you say that's an accurate description not only of the process, but of how these girls get stuck in there? And so when the police are called, these police, they see these white girls, but like you say, they're lower class, blue collar whites, so they're politically not powerful, and they don't dare take on the Pakistani gangs, and so they say, oh, well, that girl's just a runaway, that girl's just a prostitute, that girl's just a drug addict. In a way, all those things may be true, but those are the side effects of the grooming and rape slavery. It's actually a species of what they're doing in the Islamic State. Young girls being sex slave
of mujahideen. This is just happening in the UK instead of Iraq and Syria.
Indeed, and the one thing that is never cited, the one causal factor that is never mentioned, is the fact that in a country that was formerly considered an island fortress, we now have tens, hundreds of thousands, millions of people whose moral code, according to their religion at least, consider 13, 12, 11, 10, 9-year-old girls to be sexually available objects. As a contributory factor, this is never considered. With respect to the grooming process, there was an undercover police officer for Greater Manchester Police who said that, who was quoted anonymously as saying that the perpetrators, they like girls fresh. This was the term that he used. But the actual psychological process of grooming is actually even more heinous. It actually involves the girl, the victim in question, believing that she is in love with her abuser. And so the sexual horrors that follow, that are usually rape parties, gang rapes, in which the victim has very little idea that money is changing hands. Because of the lack of sexual experience of the girl in question, she has very little idea of this is abnormal. But to return to the report published, I think the issue that is bringing up is the degree of what was called by Danny Lockwood, a Dewsbury reporter, packy politics. There were two specific councillors who are mentioned in the report, a former leader of the council, who basically engage in a form of tribal politics in which they act as the intermediaries between the police and the communities they represent. And there's a tacit threat that if they don't get what they want, there will be disorder. And perhaps two of the most shocking things coming out of the report was the first thing is how much the police take on the conscious motives of the abusers, believing that the victims are voluntarily engaged in promiscuous activity. One police officer said, you know, so-and-so has raped children like you before. You're not the first and you're probably not going to be the last. And the second was an incident in which a Pakistani Muslim girl disappeared. And the first thing that the Muslim councillors did is they frog-marched themselves to the local police superintendent and demanded action. And action was immediate. It's a real insight into what is likely going to be happening and is already happening in particular communities where British people are in the minority. They're not going to be subject, and their children are not going to be subject to the kind of protections according to the law that they assume or that they're used to. Far from it.
I think Rotherham is just the tip of the iceberg. I don't think this is the last of it. I haven't seen this in Canada yet, thank God. But if we don't do anything about it, if we're not willfully looking at the problem, I'm sure it'll come here next. George Igler, thank you for joining us from the Discourse Institute in London.